All right, let's dive right into this explainer and completely demystify the profound, really complex thematic layers of F. Scott Fitzgerald's absolute classic, The Great Gatsby. Look, we all know the basic story, right? The Roaring Twenties, the flappers, the jazz, but today we're pushing way past the glitter. We are going to dig into the actual architectural bones of this narrative to figure out what Fitzgerald was really saying about identity, desire, and the seductive, often empty promises of America. We're bringing in some heavy hitters today, leaning on critical texts from scholars like Harold Bloom and Nicholas Trudell to explore that tragic, massive gap between Gatsby's reality and his grand illusion. What you should really take away from this is a much deeper understanding of how the symbols and the character motivations are woven together. It's a full-on critique of a society that has entirely lost its moral center. This isn't just a tragic love story, folks. It's a total masterclass in literary design. Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the invention of Gatsby, the motives behind the wealth, decoding the great symbols, the careless and doomed, and finally, the ultimate American tragedy. Let's get into it. Section 1. The invention of Gatsby. Creating the illusion. Think about this unbelievable contrast for a second. You have the stark reality of Jimmy Gatz, a penniless young guy from North Dakota who essentially wanted nothing to do with his shiftless parents. And then, boom, you have the entirely invented, glamorous persona of Jay Gatsby. What's so crucial here is that Gatsby doesn't just, change his name. He fundamentally attempts to rewrite his own DNA. He literally wants to be a son of God, completely disconnected from his impoverished mortal roots. Fitzgerald writes that Gatsby sprang from his Platonic conception of himself. I mean, wow. It brilliantly captures how a 17-year-old boy manifested a pure ideal. He literally fathered his own identity. The term Platonic is a nod to the philosopher Plato's idea that there's this perfect, ideal realm, and our physical world is just a messy, flawed copy. Young Jimmy Gatz basically dreamed up the absolute perfect version of himself, Jay Gatsby, and then spent the rest of his life desperately trying to force the physical world to match that flawless dream. To really wrap our heads around this, we have to look at the concept of a coarse Platonist. Critic Malcolm Bradbury coined this term, and it hits the nail on the head. It highlights how Gatsby's dream required this wild alchemy to turn base, corrupt wealth into his idealized reality. The supreme irony, Fitzgerald himself was totally seduced by the exact same decadent lifestyle he was critiquing. But the tragedy for Gatsby is that the material world he chooses, the bootlegging, the organized crime, the new money, is fundamentally rotten. He's trying to build a perfectly pure dream out of entirely corrupt materials. Which brings us to Section 2, Motives Behind the Wealth, the Illusion's Purpose. So, if Gatsby's identity is an illusion, what was the real motivation behind those massive parties with like 595 guests? Why the sprawling mansion? Well, his immense new wealth and that giant house were just tools. Actually, scratch that. They were bait. He accumulated it all specifically to capture the king's daughter, Daisy Buchanan. Every single lavish party, every custom-tailored shirt was a calculated beacon sent out into the Long Island night, just hoping to draw her in. He is trying to morph raw wealth into eros, into love, and he's attempting the impossible, recapturing a perfect moment out of time that they shared years ago. The absolutely crucial point here is that Gatsby completely confuses the buying power of money with the values of love. Literary scholar Harold Bloom brings up this fantastic, deeply ironic quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson. Money, in some of its effects, is as beautiful as roses. Gatsby mistakenly believes he can literally just purchase the past. He thinks if he just stacks up enough cash, he can magically wipe away the 5 years Daisy was married to Tom and start over with a clean slate. Moving on to Section 3, Decoding the Great Symbols, the Language of Illusion. It is so fascinating how Fitzgerald uses color as the secret language to map directly to character motivations. Green isn't just a traffic light, it's the unyielding hunger of the American dream, the fresh green breast of the New World. White, which is worn constantly by Daisy and Jordan, projects this facade of virginal purity, but it ironically masks their deep, deep moral emptiness and greed. And silver, that represents the coldness of money merging with the romantic hope of the stars. The colors are telling you the real story right beneath the dialogue. So with all this extravagant wealth, the deep-seated corruption, the fake identities floating around, we have to ask ourselves, who is actually watching this tragedy unfold? In a world that seems entirely devoid of a traditional moral compass, who is keeping score? The answer's pretty chilling. It's Dr. T.J. Eckleburg, just a pair of massive faded eyes on a defunct Queen's billboard. They serve as this illusory, commercialized god, just coldly judging the modern American wasteland. The sources point out that incredibly dark moment when the mechanic George Wilson looks up at this advertisement and literally calls it God. It really drives home that in this hyper-capitalist 1920s society, traditional faith has packed up and left. It's been completely replaced by commerce and advertising, just staring blankly over the ruin. And right beneath those judging eyes lies the Valley of Ashes. Think of it as the grim, industrial underbelly of the glamorous Roaring Twenties. It represents the inescapable mortality that Gatsby's pristine, shiny dream is desperately trying to ignore. It is a ubiquitous memento mori, a constant reminder of death. Those ash-gray men working there, they are the literal fallout of the careless wealth being thrown around over an East Egg and West Egg. You simply can't have the dazzling parties without the solemn dumping ground. Section 4. The Careless and Doomed. Colliding Worlds. Let's talk about Tom and Daisy Buchanan for a second. Their vast, inherited old money makes them terribly, terribly careless. Unlike Gatsby, who tied all his new wealth to this romantic, doomed ideal, Tom and Daisy just use their money as a shield. They carve a path of destruction through accidents and cruel negligence, and when the consequences finally arrive, they just retreat back into their wealth, completely unbothered, leaving other people to clean up the mess. Nothing captures this violent dynamic better than how the novel treats the automobile. At first, the car is this glamorous symbol of mobility and ultimate freedom, but then it transforms into a harsh, blunt instrument of death. It is Daisy driving Gatsby's ostentatious yellow car who strikes and kills Myrtle Lawson in the Valley of Ashes. She literally smashes her down, and then Gatsby, in his blind devotion, ultimately takes the blame. Which brings us to our final act. Section 5. The Ultimate American Tragedy. The American Dream. When you trace this collapse step by step, the architecture of Gatsby's downfall is just completely devastating. He pursues that ever-receding green light, he clashes head-on with the immovable reality of old money, the fatal accident happens, and finally he is murdered. But the really vital takeaway here is that Gatsby is betrayed by more than just Daisy's fickleness. He is betrayed by his own blind faith in the corrupt materials the American experience handed him. He genuinely believed that if he just worked hard enough and got rich enough, he could transcend where he came from. But the whole system was rigged from the start by people like the Buchanans. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. I mean, what a line. It so perfectly captures that heavy resignation of striving for an impossible, ever-receding dream. Fitzgerald is telling us that we are all, in our own ways, trying to row forward into this glorious future, while the current of history, class, and harsh reality is constantly pulling us backward. So, knowing what we know now about his totally invented persona, the illicit bootlegging money, and his absolutely tragic end, I have to leave you with this provocative thought. What actually made Gatsby great? Was it the fact that he successfully gamed the system to amass all that wealth? Or was it, as Nick Carraway realizes at the very end, his extraordinary gift for hope? The fact that in a deeply cynical, terribly careless world, Jay Gatsby was the single person willing to die for a dream. Thanks for joining this explainer today, and keep exploring the classics.